Who raised you more? Your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
I remember that Friday night too vividly for it to be just another evening forgotten in the haze of adulthood. I'd just finished hanging the final piece for the upcoming gallery preview, an installation I'd worked on for nearly a year in silence, in a neighborhood most of my relatives wouldn't even park in. Covered in paint and the smell of varnish, I was still running on that electric current that only comes when something important is about to happen, something that feels like it might finally shift the weight that's lived on your chest since childhood. That kind of weight doesn't go away on its own, it's earned, stitched into your skin by years of being the quirky one, the black sheep, the one with all the potential. So when I got the text from Aunt Dana around 5:30, I didn't think twice before slipping into my dress, the navy one, the one I'd been saving since January, grabbing a $38 bottle of red I couldn't really afford, and heading across town. I didn't even second-guess the vague nature of the invitation, just assumed she finally wanted to celebrate something real. Something mine. The air outside her place in Westchester was still thick with August heat. Her house stood there like it always had, clean, white, almost clinical, decorated with the same old-fashioned, curated elegance she was famous for. The kind of house where even the lemonade tastes expensive, where you take your shoes off at the door whether you're family or not, and where silence always feels one shade too close to judgment. I rang the bell, shifted the weight of the wine bottle in my hand, and smiled when the door opened. But Dana didn't move. She stood there with that smile, tight, too polite, too glossy, and she didn't even let her eyes fall to the wine. Her voice, always smooth as satin and twice as cold, said, "Hey, Emily. We're just keeping it exclusive tonight, hope you understand." For a second, I didn't. I stood there, trying to compute what the hell she meant, trying to fill in the blanks the way you do when someone says something too cruel to register all at once. But she just stood there in her beige linen dress, blocking the doorway like it was sacred ground. Her pearls, her perfect posture, the way she tilted her head, like she was letting me down gently from a ledge she'd pushed me onto. I laughed a little, not sure if it was nerves or just the shock, and said something dumb like, "Oh right. Of course." I stepped back as she closed the door with a kind of finality that only people like her can pull off without saying a word. I stood on the porch for maybe another minute, the wine bottle still in my hand, heavy and stupid and suddenly very, very unnecessary. I could hear the muffled sound of glasses clinking inside, laughter that felt just a little too familiar, and then I saw the porch light turn off. That was the signal. Party's on. But not for me. By the time I got back to my place, the wine was warm and I was numb in that way where the pain is too dull to cry about, but too sharp to ignore. I poured a glass anyway, sat on my paint-splattered couch, and opened Instagram like a masochist. And there they were, smiling selfies, boomerangs of glasses toasting, stories tagged #FamilyFirst, with all the usual faces, Greg with his sleeves rolled up and smug grin, Aunt Dana with her arm around Uncle Mike, even the twins, despite living 2 hours away. Hell, even my second cousin Lena was there, and she hadn't spoken to anyone since the '98 backyard pool fiasco. But not me. Not the artist. Not the niece who'd just spent the last 18 months pouring every last cent, thought, and ounce of sleep into a body of work that was about to debut on the Lower East Side. And for what? For the same people who told me at every Thanksgiving that art was a nice hobby, but maybe I should get my teaching certificate. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even text my mom, though I knew she'd call me in the morning with that passive tone she always uses when she's trying to act like she didn't know what was happening. I just watched that little carousel of stories play over and over until my phone died in my hand. And when I woke up the next morning, hair tangled, glass still half full, the sun already streaming through the blinds, I did what I always do. I got up. I brewed coffee. I brushed the disappointment from my teeth. Then I opened my laptop, mostly out of habit, and there it was dead center on the homepage of the New York Times. Urban Grief in Color, the raw intimacy of Emily Carter's art. My name, my photos, my work. The article was long, thoughtful, even a little poetic. They called me unapologetic in texture and brutally honest in theme, said my installations brought the undercurrent of feminine displacement to the surface in a way New York galleries hadn't seen in years. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. I didn't even blink. It was everything I had worked for, and somehow it still didn't feel real. And then the text started. First it was my cousin Rachel. "Oh my God, you're in the Times. So proud of you, girl. You're amazing." Then my mother, "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry I didn't tell you about the dinner. I thought it was just something small, I didn't think." Then Dana herself, "We need to do brunch soon. Just us girls. So proud of you. You had it in you." Suddenly, everyone who forgot I wasn't invited the night before was crawling out of the woodwork like termites dressed in pearls and pressed colors, all desperate to stand close enough to the fire to warm their frozen, performative affection. And you know what I did? Nothing. Not yet. Because sometimes silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's a fuse. And I had just decided to let it burn long enough to make damn sure they'd feel the heat. And tell me, what would you do if your family decided you didn't matter until the whole world said otherwise? Would you forgive them? Or would you make them remember what they tried to forget? It's a strange thing, waking up in the exact same bed, in the exact same skin, and somehow knowing everything has changed, not in some theatrical, fireworks over the sky way, but in the quiet, unshakable shift of gravity that pulls you just slightly closer to something you've been circling your entire life without ever quite touching. That morning, the light came through the blinds like it always did, filtered by dust I never quite managed to wipe away, falling over the corner of the canvas I'd abandoned the week before. And as my eyes adjusted and my mind crawled back into my skull from the fog of wine and silent rage, it hit me, not the hangover, but the headline. I hadn't dreamt it. I hadn't hallucinated it out of hunger for validation or revenge or whatever broken engine had kept me working alone in that freezing studio through nights when my fingers couldn't even bend around a brush anymore. It was real. The New York Times had written about me. Not someone like me. Not a trend piece buried under celebrity gossip. Me, Emily Carter. The disappointment. The invisible niece. The one who made nice things but didn't go to Yale or marry a man in finance or pose politely at garden parties in pastel silk. They had seen my work. They had understood it. And more than that, they'd said it out loud. I sat there, blinking in the dusty light, the glow of the laptop still open beside me like some strange new sun, and I reread the words for the fourth, maybe fifth time, afraid they might vanish if I stopped looking at them. There was a photo of my installation, the rusted bed frame, the stitched linens, the 100 tangled headphone cords that hung like veins from the ceiling, and below it, the critic's quote that would become both a blessing and a curse over the next month. A brutal exorcism of inherited silence. I didn't realize my hands were shaking until I picked up the mug beside the laptop and spilled cold coffee onto the keys. I didn't care. I sat there with my knees pulled to my chest, watching my phone light up again and again, buzzing on the floor like a trapped insect, and I knew, without checking, what those messages would say. Suddenly, everyone had something to say. Everyone remembered I existed. The first text came from my cousin Rachel, whose defining qualities had always been a toxic cocktail of performative empathy and relentless self-interest. Her message, filled with exclamation marks and the kind of tone people use when they want to pretend they were part of your story all along, said, "Oh my God, Emily. I literally just saw the Times piece. You're amazing, girl, I'm crying. So proud of you." No mention of the night before. No explanation for why I wasn't family enough to be part of the gathering, but somehow close enough now that my name had been printed on real paper and posted online. Then came the message from my mother, shorter, slower, almost painfully delicate, like she was stepping across glass. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry about last night. I didn't know you weren't invited. I thought it was just a small thing. Please don't be upset with them. Dana meant well." That last sentence made me laugh, not out of amusement, but from the kind of bone-deep bitterness that comes when you realize your own mother still believes that the problem is you not forgiving enough, not the others being cruel. And then, at exactly 8:42 a.m., just as I was about to toss my phone under a pile of sketchbooks and shut it all out, came the message I had somehow already expected from Dana herself. Simple. Calculated. Practiced. We should do brunch soon. Just us girls. So proud of you. You had it in you. I stared at the screen for a long time, thinking about the way her voice had sounded the night before, how easily she'd said those words, just keeping it exclusive tonight, how effortlessly she'd turned me into an outsider, how completely she'd erased me from what was supposed to be my family. And now here she was, trying to rewrite the story before it even had time to settle. No mention of the door. No apology. Just a rope thrown across the gap, as if I was supposed to grab it and pretend we'd never been on opposite cliffs. I didn't reply. Not to any of them. Not that day. Instead, I sat on my floor, staring at the torn-open envelope from the gallery, the preview invite cards half-stuffed inside, and I started thinking. Not about revenge, not yet, but about memory. About who gets to remember things the way they happened, and who gets to reshape them into something softer, cleaner, more palatable. And I knew then, with the kind of clarity that only comes once or twice in a lifetime, that I wasn't going to let them forget. See, what most people never understand about rejection, especially the quiet, cruel kind that comes with a smile, is that it never fully leaves your body. It lodges in your throat, in your fingertips, in the way you flinch when you hear laughter behind closed doors. And when you finally stand up, when you finally make something of yourself, they think you're the same person, just shinier, but you're not. You're something else entirely. You've become someone who remembers. And that's dangerous. The truth is, I could have responded with grace. I could have accepted the congratulations, let them pat themselves on the back for supporting me now that I was publicly visible, and played nice at brunch, sipping overpriced mimosas while they rewrote the script. But I wasn't interested in playing that part anymore. I'd auditioned for that role too many times, the grateful one, the quiet one, the one who waits outside while the real family celebrates. And now I had the power to turn the spotlight exactly where I wanted it. And so, when Dana sent a second message the next morning, "Are you free next weekend? Would love to catch up, just the two of us. I think we need a long overdue girl talk." I typed a simple reply. Sure, let's do brunch. But in my head, the planning had already begun, not for mimosas and reconciliation, but for something far more honest, far more lasting. Because I didn't want her apology. I wanted her to understand the cost. I wanted her to look me in the eye and realize that the girl she turned away on the porch wasn't just hurt, she was wide awake. And the thing about people like me, people who've been underestimated, dismissed, politely erased, is that once we start paying attention, we never forget. Not the door. Not the smirk. Not the lie. And certainly not the brunch. By the time Sunday rolled around and I found myself standing in front of that carefully curated little cafe on Hudson, the one Dana had chosen without even bothering to ask if I liked avocado toast or if I minded sitting elbow to elbow with women who wore athleisure as a statement of lifestyle rather than comfort, I had already rehearsed the entire conversation in my head at least a dozen times, each version slightly different. Sometimes I was biting and cold, slicing through her faux sincerity with calculated sarcasm. Other times I played it quiet and impenetrable, letting her words bounce off me like hail against a glass wall. But in the end, the version I settled on was neither cruel nor kind, just controlled, restrained, and infinitely more unsettling than anything explosive could have been. The hostess recognized Dana the moment she walked in. Of course she did. Dana had that kind of presence, the kind that moved through rooms like perfume, lingering even after she was gone, and within seconds, we were seated by the window. A table set with tiny silver cutlery and napkins that had been ironed into perfect symmetry. She wore soft pink, that careful, muted shade that spoke of wealth without screaming it, her earrings tasteful and expensive, and her smile, when she greeted me, was wide enough to hide the tremor in her voice, though not quite wide enough to hide the calculation in her eyes. She reached out to squeeze my hand across the table, as if we were conspirators in some great family adventure rather than two women sitting across from a decade's worth of silence, condescension, and curated exclusion. "You look radiant," she said, her voice coated in that effortless charm she used like a shield, and I thanked her with a quiet smile, not because I believed her, but because I wanted her to see how little effort I was making to impress her now. I had worn black, sharp, structured, deliberately under-accessorized, and I'd pulled my hair back in a way that exposed every plane of my face, every line earned by sleepless nights, creative tension, and the steady drip of disappointment that only family can distill so purely. We ordered. She chose her usual egg white omelet, no butter, no fun, and when the server disappeared, she leaned in, eyes glittering with that strange, rehearsed affection reserved for televised interviews and holiday speeches, and said, "Emily, I hope you know how proud I am of you." The Times piece was extraordinary. "Really? You've arrived." It was the way she said it. You've arrived, like I had been wandering aimlessly through some fog of mediocrity, waiting for someone with real taste to declare me visible, worthy, presentable. I nodded, murmured something polite, and waited for her to continue, knowing she would, because Dana was never satisfied with the silence of others. She needed acknowledgement, needed to be seen as generous, wise, and always on the right side of the story. She talked about the piece, about how she had shown it to her bridge group, how Margot had cried at the quote about inherited silence, how even Greg had finally come around to understanding that maybe art wasn't just a phase, but something with actual teeth. And as she spoke, weaving my work into her narrative like it had always belonged there, I felt something inside me settle, not anger, not sadness, just a deep, resounding certainty that nothing she said could undo what she had done. When I finally spoke, I didn't ask about the dinner. I didn't demand an apology or press her for an explanation. Instead, I thanked her for brunch, told her it was long overdue, and mentioned, almost in passing, like it wasn't the sharp tip of the knife, that I would be hosting a small gathering at my studio the following weekend. Nothing fancy, just a few people from the gallery, some press, and, of course, the family. I told her I'd love for her to come. She looked pleased, flattered, maybe even a little relieved, and immediately said yes, offering to bring something, wine, flowers, whatever I needed. I told her just to bring herself. And then I smiled. Not wide, not bright, just enough. The rest of the brunch was filled with her usual stories, the renovation on the lake house, how Greg's firm was expanding, how Rachel might finally be getting engaged, and through it all, I nodded, sipped my bitter coffee, and let her spin the illusion that we were, once again, aligned. But I had already made my decision. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to rehash the past. I was going to give her what she asked for: inclusion, recognition, access, and I was going to do it in my own space, on my own terms, with every word, every detail, every choice etched in the kind of quiet revenge that doesn't shout, but resonates for years. Before we left, she hugged me tightly, as if proximity could erase history, and whispered, "I'm so glad we had this time, Emily. I missed this. I really did." And I, still calm, still collected, still perfectly composed, whispered back, "Me too, Dana. I've missed being seen." I walked away from that cafe with the distinct sensation of a curtain being drawn back, not just on Dana, but on the entire fragile performance my family had been putting on for decades, the tight smiles, the rehearsed compliments, the careful distribution of approval as if it were currency, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the upcoming gathering at my studio would be more than a celebration. It would be a mirror. Because sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to people who only love the idea of you is to show them exactly who you are, unfiltered, uninvited, and finally, utterly unforgettable. By the time the day of the studio gathering arrived, the late August sun had begun to tilt its angle just slightly, throwing longer shadows over the sidewalks and softening the edge of the heat that had, for weeks, clung to the city like a damp second skin. And as I stood in the center of my studio that morning, barefoot on concrete still cool from the night before, surrounded by work that felt like memory materialized into form, torn linen soaked in resin, wire frames twisted like broken spines, a wall of Polaroids half-burned and rearranged like fragmented confessions, I realized that what I had built here was not just an installation, and certainly not a gallery event, but a reckoning disguised as celebration. A wake wrapped in the performance of success and the guest list? Well, they were walking directly into it with wide smiles and empty hands, entirely unaware that they had not been invited to be honored, but to be witnessed. I had made no formal program, sent no printed schedule, offered no promises of speeches or curated walkthroughs. Instead, I let the mystery of it hang like a fog around the invite, a private preview, family and a few close friends, an evening of art, conversation and connection in honor of recent work, and that was enough to draw them in. Because the moment my name had appeared in the New York Times, the people who had spent years ignoring what I did, or worse, minimizing it into harmless hobbyism, had suddenly remembered my existence with the intensity of a searchlight, and now they wanted proximity, not to me, but to whatever it was I had become, visible, validated, arrived. I watched them file in just before 7, the door left slightly ajar so they wouldn't have to knock, wouldn't have to wait for permission to enter the space they had once deemed irrelevant. Dana arrived precisely on time, of course, wearing a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent and clutching a bottle of white wine with a ribbon tied around the neck, her heels echoing with practiced precision on the floor as she approached, air-kissing me on both cheeks like we were in some European film about reconciliation and misunderstood genius. She looked around the studio with the kind of curiosity reserved for strangers in a foreign country, touching nothing, complimenting everything with vague phrases like, "This is just so evocative," or "I love how you've kept it raw, so organic." Behind her came Greg, all rolled sleeves and performative humility, laughing too loudly at things no one said and pretending to understand the weight of the pieces on the wall, pointing out a broken mirror installation to his girlfriend and saying something about postmodern reflection, which made me want to scream, but I didn't. I just watched. I let it all happen. I had arranged the studio carefully, not just in terms of the artwork, but in the flow of the experience, leading each guest through a carefully constructed path of my work, beginning with softer pieces, abstract canvases in muted color palettes, sculptures with gentle curves, things that looked beautiful before they made you uncomfortable. And then, just past the hanging scrolls of stitched fabric and ink drawings, they would come upon the room, the small, darkened back section of the studio, lit only by a narrow row of Edison bulbs and silent except for the soft hum of a sound loop playing an ambient recording of layered voices, whispers, fragments of laughter, and beneath it, the echo of a single sentence. Played again and again in different voices, at different pitches. "We're just keeping it exclusive tonight, hope you understand." On the left wall hung a massive collage of family photographs, all black and white, but each image subtly manipulated, faces blurred or smudged, eyes scratched out with thread, mouths sewn shut with red string. In the center of the room stood the installation I had spent the last month constructing in secret, a life-size dinner table, set with antique china and silverware, perfectly replicated from the layout Dana used at her famous family dinners. But instead of chairs, there were mirrors positioned at each place setting, cracked down the center, each one engraved with a different word: uninvited, insignificant, decorative, tolerated, background, burden. At the head of the table, mounted on the wall like a family portrait, was a large mixed-media piece I had titled The Gatekeeper, a rendering of Dana in profile, surrounded by gilded frames, her face composed entirely of other people's mouths, layered and stitched together, speaking over one another until the noise became visual. It didn't take long for the mood to shift. At first, they stood in that space silently, unsure whether to interpret the work or to pretend they hadn't recognized themselves in it. Dana's smile faltered the moment she locked eyes with her own portrait. I watched her throat tighten as she turned away, only to be confronted with her own voice repeating on loop from the speakers, warped and woven with mine. A haunting reminder that what she had said in passing, without thought, had become the very architecture of the art she now pretended to celebrate. Greg looked at me like I had slapped him. His girlfriend whispered, "Is this about them?" loud enough for me to hear, and when no one answered, they left the room together, pretending they were late for another event. One by one, the others filtered out as well, some confused, some embarrassed, a few clearly angry, but none of them said a word to me. Dana remained. She stood at the edge of the room, staring at the gatekeeper, her arms folded tightly across her chest like armor, her mouth drawn into a thin, bloodless line, and after what felt like an eternity, she turned to me and said, in a voice so low I had to lean in to catch it, "Is this supposed to be funny?" I met her gaze, calm, unblinking, and replied, "No. It's supposed to be honest." There was a moment of stillness then, the kind that presses against your eardrums like deep water, and I thought, for one wild second, that she might say she understood. That she might apologize. That she might finally see what I had seen for years. The way exclusion is never just about being left out of a dinner, but about being slowly taught that your place at the table is always conditional, always earned, never guaranteed. But she said nothing. She turned, walked out, and never looked back. I stayed until the last guest had gone, until the wine glasses had been abandoned on mismatched tables, until the sound loop faded into silence and the Edison bulbs flickered out one by one. And then I sat at the head of the table, across from the cracked mirror etched with the word burden, and I exhaled. Because for the first time in my life, they had all finally seen me, not the version they preferred, not the edited character they had shaped in their minds, but the artist, the outsider, the one who remembered. And I wasn't done. Not yet. In the days that followed the studio event, or as I began to privately refer to it, the unmasking, I found myself walking through the city with a clarity that felt almost physical. Like something had been drained from behind my eyes and replaced with an exacting kind of vision that allowed me to see not only the lines people drew around themselves, but the invisible ones they tried to draw around others, fences made of implication, silence, and soft-spoken condescension that had, for most of my life, dictated exactly how far I was allowed to go before someone gently pushed me back into place, smiling all the while. And yet now, something had shifted in the air, or perhaps, more accurately, in me, because I no longer felt the need to perform gratitude for scraps of attention, or to soften the edges of my truth in order to make others feel comfortable in the space they had built by deliberately keeping me just outside the circle. That Monday morning, barely 48 hours after the event, I received a voicemail from Dana, though she didn't leave her name, as if the tremor in her voice had finally betrayed her certainty that I would, of course, recognize her without context. In the message, she told me she was concerned that my presentation at the studio had left people confused, and that while she understood the power of artistic expression, she wondered aloud whether it was entirely fair to portray certain family dynamics in a way that, in her words, could be misconstrued by people outside the family. She paused, as if waiting for my silent agreement, then added, "I thought we had brunch because we were healing, Emily. I thought we were past this." I didn't call her back. Not because I didn't have a response. I had hundreds, laced with history and burned into my throat like cigarette ash, but because I finally understood that speaking to Dana meant entering a house with no exits, a place where walls were painted with politeness and rugs stitched with denial, and once you stepped inside, you were expected to leave your memory at the door. And I had spent too long remembering. What struck me most in the following days was not Dana's reaction, which had always been predictable in its self-preservation, but the strange ripple effect that the installation had caused among the rest of the family. Even those who had once been silent bystanders, those who had attended the dinners without asking who was missing, those who had scrolled past my posts with benign indifference for years until the New York Times gave them permission to care. A few reached out, some cautiously, others with something approaching honesty, and said things like, "I didn't realize how much you carried," or "I see things differently now," and while part of me wanted to slam the door on their belated clarity, another part, a quieter and older part, simply nodded in recognition, because I knew too well what it meant to be blind to other people's pain until it was presented to you in the only language you were taught to respect: success. My mother, for her part, called twice that week. In the first call, She danced around the subject like it was a sleeping dog she was afraid to wake, asking gentle questions about how I was doing, whether I was eating, whether the gallery had offered representation yet, and I answered in soft syllables, aware that her guilt was not the kind that could be cured with confrontation, only endured with time. In the second call, she said, very quietly, your father would have been proud, and I felt something small and stubborn break inside my chest, not sadness, not forgiveness, but the simple grief of knowing that some people will never get the apology they deserve. Only the echoes of it. A week later, I received an invitation, not formal, not printed, just a group text for a family gathering at Greg's house in Rye, a casual Saturday lunch, full of the usual phrasing, just the family, nothing fancy, let's catch up. There was no mention of the studio, no reference to the dinner that had triggered it all, just the same thin layer of gloss that had always coated our interactions, as if the whole thing had been a bump in the road, a misstep on the path to mutual understanding. And not, as I knew it to be, the first honest confrontation they'd ever had with who I truly was beneath the version of me they preferred. I didn't attend. Instead, I spent that Saturday walking alone through the city, stopping at the gallery just long enough to hand-deliver a revised portfolio to the curator who had taken a chance on me before the Times article made it safe to do so. I stood for a while in front of my favorite piece, not the most dramatic, not the most visually striking, but a small installation made of broken ceramic cups and handwritten letters stitched together with copper wire, a piece titled Inheritance. One that no one had commented on at the preview, perhaps because it was quiet and unassuming, or perhaps because it required the viewer to sit with discomfort rather than move past it. And then, sometime around dusk, I sat in a small coffee shop on Avenue C, watching the light bend across the buildings like melted gold, and I wrote a letter, not to be sent, not to be framed or exhibited, but simply to be written. It began with the sentence, "You said you understood." I wrote about the porch, about the wine bottle I held that night like an offering, about the way her eyes had skipped past me even as her smile pretended to embrace. I wrote about the silence that followed, the sudden flood of praise when my name became a currency, the absurdity of being celebrated by the very people who had once made me question whether I had anything worth celebrating. And then I wrote about the brunch, about the table, about the gatekeeper, and how it wasn't about punishment, but reflection, not revenge, but revelation. When I was done, I folded the letter and placed it in the notebook I had carried for the past decade, tucked between sketches and fragments of ideas, letting it live there as a record, not of anger, but of truth. Because in the end, I didn't need Dana to understand. I didn't need the family to rewrite their memories or to suddenly discover empathy buried beneath their curated lives. What I needed, what I had always needed, was to stop asking for space and start taking it. And that's exactly what I had done. So when people ask me now, when they look at the installation photos or read the article or try to piece together the story from secondhand murmurs and too late applause, and they ask, did it work? Did they get it? Did it change anything? I simply say this. It wasn't about changing them. It was about remembering myself.